Is the Bible green? Well, the first thing to say about this question is that it would be completely incomprehensible to any of the authors of the Bible. In fact, if we were to put that question to any of them, chances are that we'd get a rather cynical reply along the lines of, what sort of question is that? How could a collection of books compiled more than 2,000 years ago give a straightforward answer to a question whose meaning is defined by reference to concerns of the late 20th and early 21st centuries? None of the factors that led to the present predicament had even been dreamed of back in Bible times. So why would we expect it to be green by today's definitions? So right at the outset, I want to suggest that we need to dig deeper and ask different questions. Questions like, does the Bible's understanding of the natural world offer any insights into the predicament facing us today? Does the way it describes relationships between God and people and the natural world have anything to say to the questions that we might be asking? And how might we use whatever we find in its pages to address the urgent issues of climate change and environmental degradation facing us today? All this is what in other contexts we would call hermeneutics. But I suspect that many of you would never have enrolled for a seminar with a title like Hermeneutical Considerations in Relation to the Bible and the Climate Emergency with reference to strategic policies and spiritual initiatives in the light of COP26. Hence, I know I wouldn't have done. Hence the more user-friendly, though ultimately problematic question of our title, is the Bible green? And in case that sounds just like a lot of unnecessary semantic hair-splitting, let me just say that as Christians, we need, as Peter says, to be ready to give an account of our hope and to do it in a way that makes sense to other people. So in answer to the actual question, is the Bible green? I want to say, of course not. How could it be when none of its authors ever contemplated that question in the way we're now asking it today? But at the same time, I want to say, hang on a minute. There are some useful insights here into the relationship of God to the natural world and its people that I think can help us to navigate the questions that we are asking today. And for the benefit of those who really do want to know what I think I'm doing with the Bible, here are some of the hermeneutical considerations that are informing my approach. Number one, I'm seeing the Bible as a mirror rather than a model, by which I mean I'm not so much interrogating the Bible to see if it's green, I'm allowing it to interrogate us, inviting us to reflect on who we are and who we might become. Number two, I'm thinking of the Bible as a compass rather than a street map. It gives direction rather than directions. And number three, I'm going to suggest that different aspects of the Bible have emerged as relevant in different generations. These three will hopefully give some structure to our reflections here. So where to start? Well, it's not difficult to find any number of texts that mention the natural world in ways that celebrate the beauties of skies and mountains, or use the imageries of seeds and harvests and birds as paradigms for spiritual realities. In the Old Testament, we have the books of Psalms, Job, wisdom books like Proverbs, loads of examples of precisely that, while the Gospels themselves give plenty of evidence that Jesus was at home in that world as well. So we can take it for granted that in terms of the aesthetics of nature, there's no shortage of material here celebrating the wonders of the natural world. Of course, there's nothing distinctively biblical or Christian about that in and of itself. And though I will mention some of these texts, I decided instead to focus on themes that not only illuminate our understanding of our forebears in faith, but themes that might also help us to identify ways that we can engage both missionally and conceptually with the rather different challenges and opportunities that we face today. Inevitably, this has involved choices about the general trajectory of the conversation, as well as which themes to highlight and which to put on the back burner for another day. There are bound to be many loose ends in the conversation, including some hard questions that in a different space would certainly be worth thinking about. But as I've thought about all this over the last month or two, the big picture approach has certainly commended itself to me as something that can not only illuminate the past, but has the potential to inspire our future. On the one hand, I hope it'll enable us to see some useful connections between passages of Scripture that might otherwise seem random and disconnected. And on the other, and for my money this is far the more important, offering a narrative that will be accessible to concerned individuals from other spiritualities who might well turn out to be our best conversation partners if we're to make an actual difference today. Most notably, I'm thinking of Indigenous First Nation peoples and neo-pagans. So we start with a story, one that, like all good stories, begins a long time ago and in a land far away. The story that's on the very first page of the Christian Bible. People have always speculated about the origins of life and their own place in the world, and the inhabitants of the ancient Middle East were no different. Of course, people in other parts of the world had their own stories, and I'll refer briefly to some of them later. But for now, let's stick with the story that's informed Western culture through its Judeo-Christian roots. No doubt we're all familiar with the version of this story we find in the first chapter of Genesis. What we may not realize is that this is just one version among several, all of them asking the same questions, but with very different ways of telling the story. It was in the mid-19th century that an English archaeologist discovered a Babylonian creation story that was so similar to the story of Genesis 1 that there could be no doubt they were both versions of the same thing. At the time, skeptics seized on this to dismiss the Old Testament account as just a second-rate imitation, really, of a narrative copied from the wider culture. But as more information emerged, it became clear that this was quite a simplistic understanding of the relationship between these two creation stories. To be sure, both shared the same basic literary structure, and both address fundamental questions of meaning, purpose, and identity. Questions like, why are we here? How did we get here? Why is life the way it is? And so on. Well, with the benefit of hindsight, and the sort of questions we now ask about contextualization of the Bible's message, it's obvious that the Genesis version of this story represents an intentional retelling of an account that would be widely recognized in the culture of the time, but reimagined with a view to subverting its underlying message about the natural world, the relationship of humans to it, and the spiritual reality behind it. The starting point is a watery chaos, which in the cultural narrative is the home of unruly sea monsters who threaten the stability, not just of the natural order, but of the gods as well. And the gods seem to be as insecure as the humans who told the story. Watery chaos is also the starting point in Genesis, though here it's not at all threatening because it's under the control of one God with a clear plan for the human race, and the sea monsters are just part of life in the oceans. Then there are the stars, the sun, the moon, which Genesis describes functionally as lights, in strong contrast to the notion in the inherited culture that depicted them as unpredictable psychic influences that could make or break a person's life. We could actually go through the entire narrative, making a list of contrasts like that. But two key features deserve a special mention. One that's of obvious concern to us is the way that humans are regarded. In the Babylonian story, humans are made as an afterthought to serve every whim and fancy of the gods, who are themselves, of course, unpredictable in their requirements. In Genesis, humans are depicted in two ways. On the one hand, they are created on the same day as the animals, with the obvious implication that we and they are fundamentally versions of the same thing. But then a bit later, people, who, surprisingly for the time and culture, are mentioned specifically as being both women and men, are said to be made in God's image. So on the one hand, we're said to be made of dust and therefore intrinsically part of the earth, yet with great potential to make a difference insofar as we accept the responsibility of engaging with and reflecting the divine image, which in this context is an invitation to share in God's creativity. The other thing worth special notice is the way the story ends. In the cultural narratives of the day, the gods typically finished with a big party, usually at the expense of the unfortunate humans who were called in to play games and, I guess we would say today, be abused in various ways. Genesis ends with Sabbath rest, which is something to be enjoyed by God and the entire creation, a theme that goes on to play a big part in the regulations of Deuteronomy, where fields and animals flourish as a consequence of time out. They are blessed with regular Sabbaths, along with regular rotations of crops, times of jubilee and renewal, all of which can be summed up in the Hebrew word shalom, an intentional state of goodness that works positively to maintain the wholeness and well-being of the entire creation. Well, quite a few other ancient creation stories have come to light since that first discovery in the middle of the 19th century. And there are differences of detail, but all of them depict gods whose main characteristic is unpredictability and anger. Now, of course, divine anger is by no means entirely absent from the Old Testament, and there's no question that there are plenty of questions around that we don't have space and time to tackle here tonight. But there's one obvious difference. As the Babylonian deities, there are many of them for a start, they're constantly angry and fighting with one another in ways that are unpredictable and always vengeful. Whereas in the Genesis narrative, God is certainly capable of anger, but is neither unpredictable nor capricious, but dependable and fair-minded. So right from the start, the Bible begins with the accepted understandings of its time and place, and working within that cultural frame of reference offers an understanding of God and nature that both affirms the starting point and challenges the consequences of the traditional narrative. The cosmos isn't random. The natural world isn't something to be afraid of, but is the sphere of operations of a God who is both predictable and trustworthy, and that makes it the natural home of humankind. Something that's illustrated in the next couple of chapters with the story of the Garden of Eden, a place infused with the divine presence, providing the ideal space for human thriving in which plants and animals play a part under the benevolent eye of a God who's fundamentally well-disposed and generous to the natural world and its inhabitants. Much the same can be said about the stories of the Great Flood, which come a few chapters later in Genesis. Here again, we have a familiar narrative from the culture that's been reimagined, and the key difference again is in the portrayal of the gods, their relationship to the natural environment, the relationship of people to both of them. I want to come back later to this process of reimagining and contextualizing cultural narratives, as I believe it offers some insights into how we as Christians might relate to some significant ecological narratives of our day. But for now, let's move on to another early story of the Hebrew Bible. This time it's Cain and Abel, two brothers whose different outlooks on life and the environment led to one of them killing the other. This introduces us to a theme that's familiar to us today, actually, and some would say is at the heart of the environmental crisis, namely the tension between urban living and the countryside. Abel, the quintessential rural individual, content to live in harmony with the natural world, while Cain wants to set the rules and control the world of nature for his own advantage. As a consequence, Abel loses his life, and his blood spilt upon the earth makes the earth sterile. And significantly, Cain then becomes a quintessential urban inhabitant, representing everything that's wrong with city living. From that point onwards, the conflict between rural and urban, nature and civilization, becomes one of the major fault lines throughout the Old Testament story and well beyond. The story of the Tower of Babel, Genesis chapter 11, is perhaps the most dramatic example of this, though the tension between rural and urban lifestyles continues to surface as a major conflict related to the understanding of what constitutes a good life. Later in the book of Genesis, we have the story of Abraham and his nephew Lot. Here, the contrast between city living and a rural nomadic life ends up destroying the entire family. This story, of course, is undoubtedly told in rather idealistic terms, but there can be no mistaking the underlying message that a life lived in harmony with nature is characterized by hospitality and generosity, whereas city life, which by definition seeks to tame and control nature, is violent and exploitation. We see the same kind of tension in the stories of Moses. He is somebody who would have been a complete nobody had it not been for his fortuitous adoption into not only the life of the city, but of the royal household. And yet that wasn't the place where he found meaning and purpose. That needed a bush in the natural surroundings of a desert, a bush that significantly is described not just as a catalyst for spiritual renewal, but is itself in some way a personal manifestation of God. Elijah's experience on the mountain is exactly the same, as he encounters God in the silence of nature. Amos and Micah are just two of the later prophets who claim that their messages are a consequence of their rural origins. Then much later again, the Maccabees were traditional country people who found strength for their fight against urban elites in the remoteness of the natural world, as did communities like those at Qumran, not to mention the naturally wild context of John the Baptist, and of course Jesus himself and St. Paul, both of them at crucial times retreated from urban development in order to recharge their spiritual batteries by connecting with nature. There's less evidence of the rural retreat in Isaiah of Babylon, but the renewal of nature is a key sign and guarantee of the future spiritual life of the nation in those writings. Isaiah chapter 40, we're all familiar with that. In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Every valley shall be lifted up, every mountain be laid low. And on it goes, describing the ways in which human satisfaction and the good life are intricately connected with the prosperity of the natural world. The way this theme surfaces repeatedly in the messages of the prophets is actually all the more remarkable, given that one of their major concerns was the way in which Israel's historically grounded faith was so easily abandoned in favor of the Canaanite deities, whose worship seemed to be an essential part of ensuring the fertility of both crops and herds. Not that these deities were exactly benign or generous, of course, because various texts from the period show that they were just like their Babylonian relatives. They were as fickle as the weather and as uncontrollable. So no wonder urban life could seem more attractive, despite the fact that the cities could also be the source of much human misery and exploitation. Well, there's a lot more that could be said about all this, not least because the contrast between urban and rural development and the natural world in the Old Testament is actually, it's easy to exaggerate it, because many people would be both, as the city-states with their walled ramparts were generally surrounded by their own fields, and the produce of those fields would feed the populations of the cities. Maybe some of the prophets highlighted the contrast in order to make a point, and it's certainly true that the two kingdoms had different perceptions, with the northern kingdom of Israel more likely to see the rural lifestyle as the ideal, whereas the people of Judah were more biased towards life in the city. This is one of those places where there's scope for a much more nuanced reflection than I'm going to give you here tonight. Prophets like Amos and Micah emphasize their roots in the natural world, while others like Isaiah of Jerusalem and Jeremiah were more obviously rooted in the urban environment. But the key point that they all make is that this uneasy balance between rural and urban can't be resolved or even understood without acknowledging that at its heart is the issue of human exploitation and suffering. Social justice and the health of the environment are deeply connected, and these same prophets repeatedly identify greed and inequality with natural disasters. Carolyn has already given us an example from the prophet Hosea earlier tonight. Here are a few statements from Jeremiah, chapter 3. You have polluted the land with your whoring and wickedness. Therefore, the showers have been withheld and the spring rain has not come. Chapter 8. Because everyone is greedy for unjust gain, there are no grapes on the vine, nor figs on the trees, even the leaves wither. Chapter 8 and 9, because everyone is greedy and deals falsely, the mountains and pastures are laid waste. The earth will become a wasteland because there is no one who cares. And on, and we get the same themes in Amos, Micah, and some others. The expectation of limitless economic growth and its consequences for the environment might not be as recent an innovation as we imagine. And of course, many of these prophets also saw a connection between religious observance, environmental destruction, and social injustice. Amos in particular is outspoken on all these counts. Chapter 5, I despise your festivals, but let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. And the same themes can be found in Isaiah and Jeremiah. Lynn White Jr. was a prominent American historian in the period after the Second World War. That's a time, of course, when the environment issue was a mere ripple compared with the major tsunami we're seeing today. But in a lecture in 1966, he suggested that while the Industrial Revolution was the immediate cause of pollution and exploitation, its roots were actually in Christianity, and specifically in the Genesis creation story. This is what he said in a lecture just before Christmas in 1966. Christianity, in absolute contrast to ancient paganism and Asia's religions, not only established a dualism of man and nature, but also insisted that it's God's will that man exploit nature. Christianity bears a huge burden of guilt, he said. We shall continue to have a worsening ecological crisis until we reject the Christian axiom that nature has no reason for existence except to serve man. And if you're wondering, he did say man several times, because I guess he was a man of his generation. Now, this idea was based on what he read in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 to 28. Let them have dominion over, and then there's a list of the various aspects of the natural world. And it's a very good question, how that statement can be squared with the insistence of the prophets that social justice and care for nature not only go hand in hand, but are actually a divine mandate. Well, the fact that the Hebrew word translated dominion is relatively rare highlights a question that arises quite often, actually, when our access to a text is through a translation from its original language into our own. Translations aren't always as foolproof as we might imagine, and words that were perfectly adequate 100 years ago may well be misleading today, not necessarily because of any malevolence on the part of the translators, but because the English language itself is in constant flux and change. The popular view of translation tends to be that you look up a word in a dictionary and it tells you what it means. Of course, in reality, that's not how it works. And if you've ever tried to use one of those online translation tools in your phone, you'll know all about that. But words actually invariably take their meaning, not from etymology, but from the context in which they are most often used. And when you've got a rare word, or a word that's only rarely used, then that poses a particular challenge. Because there are only a couple of places where this particular Hebrew word is used in relation to the environment. The other one being Psalm 8, which is a clear reference back, actually, to the Genesis narrative. Everywhere else, this word refers to the authority of kings, or more generally of community leaders. And that, I suggest, gives us an important clue to its meaning. Deuteronomy proposes two principles that should determine how the king would rule. Chapter 17, verse 20, neither exalting himself above other members of the community, nor turning aside from the commandment of God. So, in relation to social organization, the king was to be a leader among equals, not a despot, while ideologically, everything he did was to be rooted in devotion to God. Well, of course, in practice, this meant the king should be just, loving, merciful, all those things that God had been with the nation. But of course, kings often failed to match these ideals. And on occasion, there's no question that's been the case with Christians and the environment, sometimes through misunderstanding of this verse in Genesis. Though personally, I have a lot less faith than some others that Christians have always acted in relation to what they read in the Bible. I think Lynn White Jr. was mistaken in thinking that the Christian industrialists of the Industrial Revolution, or indeed Christians of any generation, have gone to the Bible to find out what it might say before putting into operation whatever it was that they were working on. More often than not, I think our forebears have probably behaved without any reference at all to what the Bible might have to say, whether in this or some other passage. Well, hopefully up to this point, I've said enough already to indicate what I meant when I said the Bible offers us a mirror through which to view ourselves and our own culture. But there's more. Western Christianity has often spoken of God's two books, one being Scripture and the other being the book of nature. Now, there is of course some truth in that, though arguably the book of nature is also there in the book of Scripture. I'm referring, of course, to the wisdom tradition, represented by books like Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, and several others. Like the Genesis passages, these books also have much in common with literature from other cultures, in this case most notably ancient Egypt. Though unlike the Genesis passages, there's little difference between the wisdom traditions in the Bible and those of other nations. And though God features, the emphasis is on everyday observations about life. So in Proverbs, humans are encouraged to learn from the innate wisdom of the natural world. In fact, animals are often depicted as having more common sense than humans. But perhaps the most striking distinctive about this literature is the development of the concept of wisdom itself. Proverbs chapter 8, verses 22 to 31 personifies wisdom in a way that's not only striking, but also offers a direct connection to the New Testament in relation to our thinking about biblical ecology. Here, wisdom is described not only as existing prior to creation, but also as being alongside God as a partner in the work of creation itself. And in the early Christian centuries, this personified wisdom, or Sophia, came to be understood as the female embodiment of the entire cosmos. Wisdom chapter 8, verse 1, she deploys her strength from one end of the earth to the other, ordering all things for good. And by the time of the New Testament, it was taken for granted that there was some mystical connection between God and nature, symbolized by Lady Wisdom. Well, if the world of the Old Testament was concerned with the relationship of nature to the divine, the world in which the earliest churches emerged was dominated by questions of the relationship of nature to human self-realization, encapsulated in the contrast between the material and the spiritual. The intellectual trendsetters of the day, influenced by the philosophy of Plato and others, insisted that the spiritual and the material were incompatible. Indeed, that the material, which included our own physical embodiment as part of nature, it was actually a hindrance to finding one's true self, which is entirely spiritual or disembodied. As you can imagine, this led to some heated arguments among the early Christians as to how Jesus, who was self-evidently a spiritually oriented individual, could also be physically embedded in the world of nature. So, was Jesus of Nazareth some sort of illusory physical shell, temporarily inhabited by a spiritual being, the Christ? Well, the fourth Gospel and letters of John address this by insisting that the word, or logos, which was a familiar term from the wisdom tradition as well as from Greek philosophy, that this logos was indeed embodied in a real physical body. But St. Paul went further, much further, by not only picking up themes from the wisdom tradition, but relating them directly to Jesus and declaring that he was indeed the cosmic Christ, making the remarkable claim that Jesus is foundational to the cosmos, which in turn is somehow grounded in him. Colossians chapter 1, firstborn of creation, before all things, in him all things hold together, reconciling all things to himself. And that same connection between nature and Jesus the Christ is also in Romans chapter 8, where the renewal of creation is an integral aspect of future redemption. Then there's the way that Matthew describes the world of nature closing down as Jesus is crucified, Matthew 27:45, and the language used by both Peter and Paul in describing the cross as the tree, connecting the death of their Saviour to a living plant. Now, it's fair to say that Western Christianity has generally shied away from serious engagement with any of this. Teilhard de Chardin, Matthew Fox are two of the very few who've done so, and both of them are generally dismissed as either curiosities or heretics, or both. And there's no doubt that it invites us into territory that can be both alien and threatening to many of us, because it's a mysticism that calls not only for reverence for the natural world as part of Christian devotion, but also introduces us to a God who's not an outside observer, but is part of the messiness of life itself, constantly involved and engaged in bringing new things to birth. So I wonder if this is one of those biblical themes that has so far remained in the background, but whose time has now come. I began this talk by highlighting how an ancient creation story was retold in a way that offered a better narrative of human purpose than its original iteration. One of the things I sense that we struggle with today is what a distinctively Christian version of the prevailing ecological narrative might be. After all, you don't need to be a Christian to recognize the environmental and social justice issues. In fact, in many cases, non-Christians see them more clearly than we do. I wonder if the place to start this might be with this connection, this combination of creation, wisdom, the cosmic Christ, and their connection with the crucifixion, resurrection, and gift of the Spirit in the New Testament. And furthermore, I want to ask, who might our partners be in such an enterprise? Now, as I've reflected on this, I can't avoid thinking that I've heard something like it before in so many indigenous spiritualities around the world, whether from First Nations storytellers or closer to home here in Scotland, neo-pagans. I think both our cultures have something to learn here. Creating harmony is a central idea in most indigenous spiritualities. Social justice, not so much. And the reverse is true of our Western Christian spirituality. I think there's a lot that could be unpacked here. In fact, it would take several talks of this kind and maybe a whole book to do justice to this theme. But for now, let me leave you with 3 thoughts which I'm thinking about myself and which are certainly engaging my reflections as we move forward in thinking about this topic. First of all, the book of Acts has 2 stories that I believe are relevant here. There's the story of Peter's visit with Cornelius, Acts chapter 10, in which he discovered that actually, though he was going there to take the good news to Cornelius, God was already ahead of him, even though Cornelius was apparently the wrong sort of person. And then alongside that, there's the account of Paul's visit to Athens, in which his starting point for his own message was an affirmation of the spirituality reflected by the place of the unknown God in that city's culture, Acts chapter 17. I think both these stories invite us to begin our engagement with others by listening before we speak and recognizing that we don't own God, we don't contain God, we're not taking God into the world. God is already there in many different forms. Second thing, one of our temptations in addressing the environmental crisis, I think, is that we're tempted to repeat the mistakes of the past with a sort of new imperial approach dominated by the interests of the powerful, in which we tackle issues of justice and fairness by telling other people what will be good for them. A sort of secularized Christendom, if you like. And I fear that many of our solutions to the crisis are exactly that. They're going to benefit us and our industries to some extent more than they will benefit the indigenous peoples around the world who are most at threat. The third thing is this. I've been to Australia many times over the last 20 years or so. And the one thing I've heard over and over again on every visit when I've spoken with Aboriginal followers of Jesus is this. They say to me, you know, if instead of coming the way your forebears did, if only they'd come and listened to our Dreamtime stories and just told the stories of Jesus alongside of them, the entire history of our continent would have been very different. Because actually, we were already there. We already were in tune with that very same story. And the 2 elements of it, the dream time and the stories of the Gospels, would have led us in a much more holistic dimension than has happened. Much the same thing could be said of Native Americans and other First Nations people around the world. So finally, as we seek to follow the biblical model and work to reimagine the prevailing narratives of our day, what better way to end than with words from 2 missional giants of a previous generation. First of all, from Vincent Donovan, missionary amongst the Maasai, in his book Christianity Rediscovered. He writes this: in working with others, don't try to call them back to where they were. And don't try to call them to where you are, as beautiful as that place may seem to be. You must have the courage to go with them to a place that neither you nor they have ever been before. And another shorter statement from John V. Taylor, one-time Bishop of Winchester in the Church of England, who writes, there is no such thing as safe theology. So if we're feeling unsafe with all this tonight, I think I'll have done a pretty good job. But thank you for joining us, and thank you for your attention.